Chen Zi'ang, Ganyu, number 6. When I observe the changes of the dragon, I know the zenith of the yang power. No matter how dark and thick the stone forests, or how deep the caves, they cannot bar its passage. Of old, those who acquired the immortal's way must indeed have been in harmony with the workings of nature. Such subtle inspirations are not for the dull to perceive. Which of them can plumb such fathomless depths? Men are bound by what they see with their eyes. Warm with wine, they laugh at the book of the elixir. On the Kunlun is the jasper tree. How can they ever gather its blossoms? So we continue with poems from Chen Zi'ang's collection, the Ganyu, which can be translated as stirred by my experiences. We don't have clear datings, but it was probably began around 689. We've already talked about Chen Zi'ang and the Ganyu in the previous section. I think this is an interesting poem to comment because of the possibility or not of an allegorical interpretation of the poem. The version I have just read you is a translation by, let me see, Richard M.W. Ho, who has a monograph on Chen Zi'ang, which I haven't had time to read yet. I have a different translation, which I'll be reading in a moment, by Stephen Owen, taken from the Poetry of the Early Tang. We mentioned that it was traditional to interpret the poems in the Ganyu by Chen Zi'ang as allegorical, darkly coded poems that criticized the politics of his own day, basically the usurpation of the Tang dynasty's throne by Empress Wu Zetian and her deposing of her children. Now, traditionally, the interpretation of this poem has been in that line. So we could make a reading of this poem which reads it as political criticism and basically as a complaint for the deposition of the Tang emperor. But Chonzong in this case. But before we go to that interpretation, which is open to discussion, it's open to discussion in all of the poems of the Ganyu, but perhaps more so in some than others. Let's make a very brief commentary on the superficial meaning of this poem. So this poem is strongly Daoistic, as you might have noticed. So it starts with this image of the dragon. The dragon is a traditional symbol in Chinese geomancy and popular religion, also in Taoism, and in the emblems from the Book of Change. It's a symbol of a series of elements which include the principle of yang, of force, of initiative, of activity, of activeness, of sunshine, of brightness. It has a whole range of meanings associated with it. But the main one, the essential one, is the dragon as this force of activeness, generally associated with the emperor. So we have this yang power, this dragon, but he's locked in a cave. And this metaphor, this image, the dragon locked in a cave, is then expounded through the Taoistic imagery of the rest of the poem. In the rest of the poem, basically, you get this message that just as the dragon is trapped in a cage, just so the truths of Taoism and probably of the wisdom of Taoist practitioners is rejected or is not valued by the rest of the world, which could be viewed as this cave where the dragon lingers in, if you wish. So just as the dragon lies hidden in the cave but has this potential for escaping from it and releasing itself, so the dragon, so the immortal, or the Taoist sage who follows the paths of the immortals, is not recognized by the world, is made fun of and lives in relative isolation, made fun of by the common man, the vulgar people who, do not aspire and do not believe. They're too materialistic to aspire or to believe to the Daoistic promises of communion with nature, of transcendence, of escape from the world. So that's one message of this poem, or that's a face reading of what it says. So basically, it's a Daoistic poem in which the poetic persona is that of a Daoist practitioner who knows the arts of alchemy and of Daoist practices and who hopes through them to achieve transcendence. But he incurs the scorn, the ridicule of the ignorant crowd, of the big mass of the people. Now, you could make a case that this is what the poem says. In fact, Stephen Owen, in his interpretation of the poem, well, he says, as I mentioned in the previous video, that some poems in the Ganyu are pretty clearly allegorical. Others probably are not allegorical. Others are in a grey zone. And I think Stephen Owen generally believes that this is not an allegorical poem. He rejects these interpretations by Chen scholars, especially Chen. And, Owen says, you could interpret this poem allegorically, but you could interpret it non-allegorically. And even if you interpreted it allegorically, it's not clear how you would read the symbols that it includes. So moving on to the allegorical interpretation. So in that interpretation, this poem would be a complaint at the usurpations of Empress Wu, as we mentioned. The poem is full of mythical references with the dragon, who is generally associated with the emperor. The stone forests that are mentioned in the third line are typical of the south of China. I mean, they're caves with stalactites and stalagmites. And at the time when this poem might have been written, there's around 684, Emperor Chonzong had been deposed and sent into exile in the south, into the state of Chu. So both the dragon and the yang power might be referring to him. Thus, if one day this supreme symbol of the yang, the dragon, were to free itself of all its tethers, it would not brook hindrance by dark stone forests or deep caves, which are yin, like the empress, the feminine principle. That is, yin is the passive, the acquiescent, but also the feminine principle. So this poem, if you accept this interpretation, would be championing or expressing a belief in the revival of the fortunes of the house of Li, of the imperial family of the Tang dynasty. Now, again, you could make this interpretation, but it still gives rise to problems. So the dragon that might refer to the Tang royal house, it could also refer to an ambitious official, or even stretching the metaphor to the unusual political circumstances of Chen Zi'ang's time. It could be the empress herself, transforming herself into a dragon emperor and leaving behind her female and hidden Jin nature, and showing herself, in fact, to be the essence of pure yang. So, curious poem. Let's take a look at it, as usual, couplet by couplet, although I think we've generally unweaved already the main meanings it could have in the literal and in the allegorical interpretation. First couplet. When I observe the changes of the dragon, I know the zenith of the yang power. So, again, this imagery that starts the poem strikes a lot of the Yijing of the Book of Changes. So changes are mentioned. The word for changes is mentioned in this line, and it's the same word for changes, I believe, that is employed in the Book of Changes. So when the poetic persona sees the changes of the dragon, I know the zenith of the yang power. The dragon is generally associated with the first hexagram of the Yijing, which is, I think it's called Qian, heaven. And it's composed of, the hexagrams in the Yijing are an alternation of 6 broken or unbroken lines. Qian, the first hexagram, is 6 straight lines, and it denotes a strong beginning, it denotes the emperor rising, and so on. So, observing the changes of the dragon, one perceives the zenith of yang power. An unbroken line is yang, so 6 unbroken yang lines are the maximum of yang power. So this is what the poetic persona observes through geomancy, or just through observing the events of the world. These changes and this growth to its maximum of the yang power. So the yang power is going to grow, and he sees it in the dragon's changes. What are these changes? Well, the second couplet seems to imply that something has happened to the dragon. The dragon has lain hidden. So only a clever, discerning person would have been able to detect these dragon's changes while the dragon seems to be imprisoned or hidden in a cave. No matter how dark and thick the stone forests, or how deep the caves, they cannot bar its passage. So, these first two couplets include this image, this metaphor, could be this Xing of the dragon in captivity, whose great power and future perspectives are perceived by the poetic persona. Again, as we said, this could be mere divination. This dragon could be symbolic of maybe the poet himself. Maybe he considers himself the hidden dragon who has this potential that nobody else sees yet. It could be another important courtier. It could be the emperor who was deposed. It could be the empress, who is this real young power in disguise. So the next couplets move on to a different line. After the explanation of this metaphor, the next couplets all follow the line of describing how the masses ignore the truths of Daoist occult lore. Third couplet. Two. Of old, those who acquired the immortal's way must indeed have been in harmony with the workings of nature. So pretty stable. The tradition is, in Taoism, you try to achieve harmony with nature. And, Taoists believed that through different alchemical and religious and meditation and ascetic practices and religious practices, one could manage to prolong one's life indefinitely, even to achieve immortality and escape from this worldly realm. So, the poet is just explaining this. Since of old we know that people have harmonized with nature and have become immortal or followed this way to immortality. Next couplet. Such subtle inspirations are not for the dull to perceive. Which of them can plumb such fathomless depths? So this is the 1, 2, 3. This is the fourth couplet, I think. Yeah. And this brings a slight turn of the idea of the poem, which will continue in the next couplets, which is the idea that these truths of transcendence and wisdom are inaccessible to the common people. Only the superior man, and we might imply the poet, considers himself such. Only he is able to, detect, harmonize with nature, and really understand these truths that a crass, materialistic, ignorant, short-sighted mind cannot access to. Next couplet reinforces this idea that these depths cannot be plumbed by the dull. Men are bound by what they see with their eyes. Warm with wine, they laugh at the book of the elixir, where the book of the elixir, or the Cinnabar classic, refers to Daoist works on the cult of immortality. So most people do not understand or do not believe this. They're too ignorant or materialistic to believe that immortality can be attained through learning and practices. And they're bound by their eyes, by what they see with their eyes. Finally, the last couplet reinforces or hammers in this idea with a beautiful image with mythological overtones. On the Kunlun is the jasper tree. How can they ever gather its blossoms? We mentioned the Kunlun Mountains. They were the remote western mountains of Chinese folklore, like the end of the world in a certain way. And it was believed that there the Zi'ang Mu, the Queen Mother of the West, lived, and there she had a garden with the famous peaches of immortality. So, in that far place, in the jasper tree on Kunlun, these vulgar men cannot aspire to go there. They cannot ever gather the blossoms and presumably the fruits of immortality gained through Daoistic practice. So they will be excluded from this world of immortality and pleasure because of their short-sighted pleasure and materialism. Okay, let's read to conclude Owen's take on this same poem. I have observed the dragon's transformation and now understand the essence of pure yang. How dense and dark is the forest of stone and the hidden cave where no one tarries. Those who found the immortal way of old were truly the match of the basis of change. The feelings of mystery, no childish knowledge. Who can plumb the engulfing dark? Men of this world are limited by what their eyes see. Drunk with wine, they laugh at the sin of our classics. But on Mount Kunlun, there are trees of jade. How can we get to pluck the bloom?